Daniel Hayes stopped beneath the old oak tree where, 10 years ago, he'd carved his name alongside the woman he loved. The backpack on his shoulder carried a fragment of the war, a crumpled letter he had never sent. The town was silent, with no flags, no brass bands, only the gaze of his daughter from a distance. Familiar yet strange, like a riddle he couldn't solve. At the end of the street, the abandoned woodworking shop groaned on its hinges, as if calling him closer, whispering about a secret only survivors could understand. Sometimes, the most frightening thing isn't the war itself, but what's left behind when it's over. That afternoon had the kind of warm gold you get in early fall. Not the bright festival kind, but a gold mixed with a little gray smoke, a little of the tiredness that comes when the days start getting shorter. Daniel Hayes stepped down from the interstate bus, his boots hitting the damp, cool pavement. The old backpack slung over one shoulder hung loose, its straps worn pale, like it had followed him across 1,000 miles. He stood there for a moment, took in a deep breath, letting the scent of wood smoke from the town's chimneys fill his lungs, a smell that brought him back to winter nights long ago, when he was just a kid, sitting by the fire, listening to logs pop and crackle. The road into town was so quiet, his footsteps blended with the dry rustle of maple leaves skittering in the wind. On the roofs of two-story wooden houses, thin smoke drifted sideways before fading into the soft sky. Each step felt like walking through an old film reel. This town hadn't changed much. It was him who had. He didn't head for the boarding house like he'd planned. Instead, his feet carried him toward the elementary school in the middle of town. The green gate's paint was peeling, flanked by tall elms whose yellow leaves had piled thick along the path. The school bell rang, followed by the sudden roar of children spilling out. The sound was ordinary, yet it gripped something in his chest, like an invisible cord pulling tight. From across the yard, the wave of kids in their colorful jackets pushed toward the gate. Daniel stepped back into the shade, letting his eyes search on their own for the face he knew. Then he saw Emma. She was walking with a couple of friends, her hair tied back neat, a few loose strands falling across her forehead. The light hit it just right, turning it a soft, pale brown. But her eyes were cast down, missing the carefree spark of the other kids. Daniel stood still, watching her like every blink might cost him this moment. He took a step forward, and she noticed him. There was no shout, no sudden dash in his arms. She slowed, like weighing something, then set her small hand into his. Her skin was soft, a little cool, but the warmth in her palm began to spread. Up his arm, through the layers of his coat, all the way to the place inside him that had been dry for years. In that moment, a quiet joy began to take root. It didn't burst loud, but settled in gently, like the last light of day slipping down a porch rail. And right beside it came another heartbeat, one made of kind of fear. He knew joy like this was fragile, like morning frost on leaves. Without care, it could vanish. His hand closed a little tighter, not to keep Emma from leaving, but as a promise to himself that he'd guard this feeling, this sense of being alive and connected, no matter the cost. Coming home from war had taught him to fight for survival, but this was different. This was a fight to hold onto something worth holding. They left the schoolyard together, blending into the slow trickle of people on a narrow street. The wind brought the smell of wood smoke again, now mingled with the faint scent of his daughter's hair. Daniel felt his stride steady. No one had to say a word. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he'd found his reason to face it, and that reason was walking right beside him, her small hand tucked in his, in the pale gold light of an early autumn afternoon in their hometown. From across the street came the smooth hum of an engine shutting off, different from the faint hiss of the older cars you usually heard in this town. The black SUV gleamed like a block of steel fresh out of a showroom, its paint catching the soft autumn light. Daniel recognized it before he even saw who stepped out. The passenger door opened, and Rachel appeared. Same frame, that golden hair now cut shorter, a long cream coat pulled in at the shoulders. Beside her stood Frank Miller, tailored suit, tie knotted without a crease, the kind of face that carried the confidence of someone who always had the upper hand. He smiled, a perfect smile with nothing behind it, like a pane of glass hiding something colder. Rachel took a few steps forward, stopping just far enough that her voice could carry to Daniel, and to anyone else near the school gate. Her tone was low but sharp, like the edge of a knife. "You have 2 hours with her." Daniel didn't answer. He wasn't about to let his words fall in the middle of this small town street, where strangers' eyes and ears could cut sharper than scissors. Still, he could feel every muscle in his face pull tight, a heat rising under his skin. He didn't know who else caught her words, but to him, being sliced down to a sliver of time, measured by the sweep of a clock hand, was both humiliating and bitter. Frank stayed beside Rachel, hands in his pockets, watching with the cool appraisal of a man deciding whether to buy or toss something. No open malice, but in his eyes was the reminder of who held the power here. Daniel looked down, finding Emma's hand. She'd been holding on since they'd left the school gate, but now he tightened his grip as if afraid a cold gust might snatch it away. Emma glanced up at him, her deep brown eyes not yet full of questions, but carrying a cautious flicker too old for her age. He led her forward, stepping out of the SUV's shadow. The first few steps felt heavier than they should have. On the sidewalk, the late-day sun broke through the elms and patches, leaving streaks of light and shadow like strips of old memory. They passed the corner grocery, the glass front throwing back a reflection of the two of them. A man with slightly hunched shoulders in a worn coat, and a thin little girl, her hair trembling in the wind. In that reflection, Daniel saw more clearly than ever how fragile what he had beside him really was. With each step, he realized the silence between them wasn't an empty coldness. It was what was holding them together after what had just happened. The smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery next door, mixing with chimney smoke from somewhere farther off, but it didn't ease the tightness in his chest. Only when they turned down a narrow street did the engine noise behind them finally fade. Daniel didn't look back. He knew that SUV would leave the way it came, smooth, quiet, leaving nothing behind but the sense that his space in the world had just been trimmed smaller. He kept walking, still holding Emma's hand, feeling its warmth rise bit by bit, like passing and receiving a promise without words. The first gust of early autumn swept through, spinning a few maple leaves across the sidewalk. Daniel lowered his head, not to dodge the wind, but to see her face more clearly. In her eyes, he caught a small light, tiny, but enough for him to know that the brief joy of seeing each other again was something worth guarding with everything he had. And in that moment, he knew he wouldn't let anyone shorten that time again. Their footsteps blended with the crackle of dry leaves underfoot, falling into a steady rhythm, the rhythm of a resolve taking shape. No words, just the walk, heading toward wherever he believed he could rebuild a piece of quiet for the two of them, no matter what stares or cold words they left behind. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a cold, pale glow, catching every speck of dust drifting in the air. Daniel sat in a wooden chair against the wall, hands resting on his knees, thumb running over the frayed seam of his jeans. The faint smell of old paper and varnished wood lingered, something that took him back to afternoons in the town library when he was a kid. On the large table in the middle of the room, the will sat neatly arranged, thick pages bound inside a dark brown leather folder. The attorney, a man with neatly combed silver hair and thin-rimmed glasses, was reading it aloud, line by line, in an even low voice. No one interrupted. The only sounds beyond his voice were the soft rustle of pages turning and the faint tap of a pen from someone waiting their turn. Daniel glanced at the row of chairs across from him. 3 of his cousins sat shoulder to shoulder, dressed in dark coats, faces set but with the occasional twitch at the corner of the mouth, like holding back a smile. On the table, one of their coffee cups still steamed, its bitter scent mixing with the smell of paper. When the first pieces of property were read out, a 3-story wooden house on the South Hill, a lot near the lake, bank accounts. Each of them nodded, faces shifting into the kind of satisfaction you see when a deal goes exactly as planned. Every sentence was followed by the soft scrape of a chair, a quick exchange of glances, a sigh that felt like ownership settling in. Daniel stayed still, eyes fixed on the dark wooden floor where the light picked out every scratch. He hadn't expected much. After all these years away from the town, his only real connection to Uncle Samuel had been a few Christmas cards and a short phone call when he left the service. Still, somewhere inside, there was the faint hope for something, not in dollars, but in some sign that he still belonged to this family. Then the lawyer paused, looking at Daniel over the rims of his glasses. His voice didn't change, but the room seemed to tighten. For Mr. Daniel Hayes, Whisper Timber Yard, the sawmill closed for more than 10 years. No explanation, no list of assets, just that one short, bare sentence. A chair creaked across the way, this time from his cousin's side. One of them tilted a head toward another, trading glance. No words, but the expression said enough. We called it. Daniel felt the blood drain from his hands and feet. He looked up, met the attorney's gaze, not unkind, but not inviting either, then looked back at the brown leather folder. The words Whisper Timber Yard seemed pressed deeper into the page, leaving a mark he couldn't rub out. The smell of old wood in the room felt stronger now, carrying a faint memory of afternoons in the shop with Uncle Samuel. The weight of a hand planing a board, sunlight slipping through the cracks, the dry rattle of shavings hitting the floor. Back then, the mill had been alive. Now, the name had been handed to him like something left over, something nobody else wanted. No one said a word about his share. The reading went on, numbers and property descriptions sliding past like water over stone. Daniel sat straight, but inside, cold surprise mixed with a dull sting, and somewhere a thin thread of resolve just starting to form. When the lawyer closed the folder, the soft click of the clasp cut the quiet. Everyone rose. One cousin gave Daniel a short nod. Not a greeting, more like confirming the distance between them. Another busied herself tucking papers into a leather briefcase without looking his way. Daniel stood last. Walking down the narrow hallway toward the door, the smell of old wood drifted past again, this time edged with the sharp bite of autumn night air seeping through the crack. He gripped his backpack strap tighter, feeling like he was carrying more than just a few personal things, like he was carrying a question with no answer. Why that mill, and why him? Outside, the town's streetlights cast scattered pools of yellow. His breath rose in thin clouds. Daniel paused, looking toward the road that led out past the edge of town, to the land and the sawmill that had sat dark and silent for over a decade. Somewhere between the spaces left by loss and quiet, a small flicker of determination sparked, faint but certain, as if that worthless inheritance had just become a challenge meant for him alone. Night settled over the town like a heavy blanket, swallowing the narrow streets whole. The sickly yellow of the street lamps spilled weak light across a thin layer of fog, just beginning to settle on the ground. Daniel drove his old pickup out of the center and toward the edge of town. The road narrowed, flanked by trees stripped nearly bare, their skeletal branches clawing up at the cold silver sky. He stopped at the iron gate of Whisper Timber Yard. The wooden sign hanging beside it was weathered to gray, the carved letters fading until only parts of the word whisper could be read when the moonlight struck at just the right angle. When he put his hand to it, the hinges groaned, long, high, and sharp, like the breath of something that hadn't been touched in years. Inside, the dark was thick. Moonlight filtered through the gaps in the rusted tin roof, falling onto the floor in scattered patches, like the scorch marks left from half-burned embers. The air hit him with the damp smell of neglect, tangled with the stale sweetness of old sawdust. Familiar once, now tainted by the metallic tang of rust and the sourness of rotted cloth. Daniel stood at the threshold, letting his eyes adjust. The shape of the shop emerged like a memory buried under dust. Planers, bandsaws, each frozen mid-motion, their bodies wrapped in a skin of gray corrosion, gears locked stiff. From the walls hung coils of wiring stripped bare in places, like dried veins from a body that had once been alive. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the present recede so the past could step forward. Back then, the roof was whole, and midday sunlight streamed down in clean, bright stripes across the floor. The saws droned steady, the planers hissed over fresh timber, and the air was thick with the sweet resin of newly cut pine. 10-year-old Daniel ran loops around the shop, arms full of scrap wood, peppering Uncle Samuel with questions about dovetail joints and sandpaper grit. Now, the only sound was the wind slipping through the roof seams, whistling low like a whisper. Dust lay so thick on the floor that every step left a sharp, clear print. In one corner, an old pile of sawdust had collapsed into a damp, matted clump, smelling of paper left too long in the rain. Daniel moved deeper in, the heel of his boot knocking against a long board lying across the path. He bent, lifted it. It was lighter than he expected, the core eaten away. The paint flaked off in chunks, revealing warped, uneven grain. He set it back down gently, his hand coated in dust, feeling like he'd touched a piece of memory too far gone to save. He stopped in the center of the shop and looked up at the roof. Through the holes, the night sky showed a scattering of lonely stars. A slice of moonlight angled down onto Samuel's old workbench, still in the same spot, as if no one had dared to move it. The dust on its surface lay thick enough for him to write his name with a fingertip. A faint breeze moved through, and somewhere overhead a timber groaned. Daniel stood still, the sense growing that the place was breathing, slow, heavy, almost labored. This shop had been part of him once, part a man who had trusted him with something everyone else thought worthless. And in that quiet, he understood. Left alone, it would fall apart completely. He stepped to the bench, laid his palm on the cold wood. His fingers traced the old knife scores, the chisel marks, each one the remnant of a workday, a small story only Samuel would know. Standing there in the dark, in the damp, Daniel felt something strange, as if everything here was waiting for him. Not to be remembered, but to decide whether it would go on living or be buried for good. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a few dry maple leaves through the crack in the door. They spun across the floor, circling the shadows before disappearing into the deep, unbroken darkness of a sawmill that had been asleep for more than 10 years. The next morning, a thin veil of fog still clung to the rooftops on the edge of town. Daniel returned to Whisper Timber Yard just as the sun was easing up over the horizon, its pale light pouring through the air like it had been strained through a sheet of gauze. He pulled the old pickup to a stop by the gate, stepped out, his boots crunching over the carpet of maple leaves the wind had swept into a pile overnight. In his hand was an old padlock he'd found in the suitcase Uncle Samuel had left behind. The metal had aged to a dull bronze, its surface smoothed with fine scratches from years of handling. Its shape was unusual, different from any ordinary lock, which immediately made him think of the big wooden cabinet sitting untouched in the corner of the shop the night before. Inside, the musty smell from last night still lingered, but the early light slipping through the holes in the tin roof softened the gloom. Dust drifted lazily in the beams, swirling like tiny, pale insects. Daniel walked straight to the far corner, to where the cabinet leaned against the wall, its surface mottled with water stains and fine cracks. The lock fit the latch perfectly. The metal turned with a soft click, followed by a faint snap, like the last breath of something that had been waiting to be opened. The door was heavy, the hinges groaning as he pulled it toward him. The scent of dry wood mixed with old paper spilled out. On the top shelf lay a few black and white photographs, yellowed and curling at the edges. He picked one up. Uncle Samuel, decades younger, standing before a long workbench with a measuring stick in his hand, neatly stacked boards behind him. Another photo showed a group of men in uniform, the handwritten scrawl around the border now mostly faded, only a few words still legible. On the second shelf sat a small wooden box, its lid carved with looping, intricate lines. When he touched it, the surface felt smooth, as if someone had polished it countless times. The lid was held shut by a simple sliding clasp. He didn't open it yet, just set it on his lap, tracing the grooves with a fingertip. The meaning didn't come to him right away, but something about it felt familiar, like a fragment from one of his uncle's old stories. At the bottom, propped against the back of the cabinet, was a thick brown envelope tied with a worn length of twine. The knot was crossed neatly, the kind made by someone more used to working with their hands and their voice. Lifting it, Daniel felt there was more inside than paper, something rigid, maybe a key, maybe some small metal piece. He pulled a wooden chair closer, then stopped. Instead, he slid down to sit on the dusty floor, leaning his back against the cabinet. The chill from the boards seeped through his pants. Wood dust clung to the hem of his coat. He set each item in front of him. The photographs, the box, the envelope. The room was so still he could hear the faint wind outside, the subtle rattle of the roof. His fingers lingered on each photo, especially the ones of Samuel's face. The creases when he smiled, the narrow but bright eyes, the straight stance that was never stiff. He couldn't remember all the days those moments were from, but each line and shadow in the paper carried something old, part strange, part familiar. He turned the wooden box in his hands, tilted it, and heard the faint shift of something inside. A small sound, but enough to tell him there was something waiting to be revealed. Then he picked up the envelope, feeling the rough twine under his fingertips. The knot was firm, but not stubborn. He paused there, his hand hovering over it, as if wanting to stretch the moment out. Through the breaks in the roof, the morning light cast his shadow long across the dusty floor. 3 small objects lay before him, but their weight seemed to settle over the whole room, pressing down on his chest, heavy with what he didn't yet know, and with the quiet certainty that whatever they led to, no one else would ever see it but him. Daniel loosened the twine, the rough fibers sliding off slowly, leaving faint marks across his fingertips. He opened the flap of the envelope and tipped it, letting the contents spill out into the light. First came a stack of yellowed pages, old timber contracts, the typewritten ink smudged in places, the stamped seals so faded they were barely legible. In the margins, written in slanted blue ink, were notes he recognized instantly. Uncle Samuel's handwriting. Among the dry, printed lines, those hand-scrawled words felt like whispers breaking through, marking, underlining, sometimes just a single solitary question mark. Next were a few loose sheets, clearly personal notes. The writing was uneven, some hurried, some deliberate, with ink that ran from dark to faint. Daniel skimmed across the fragments. Last shipment, payment pending, don't sign until. Bits and pieces, like stones scattered along an old road. No telling yet where they led, but certain they'd once mattered deeply to someone. Finally, from the bottom of the envelope, slid a small metal key. Not large, its bow rounded slightly, the surface worn smooth in spots where it had been handled over and over. Daniel turned it in his hand, feeling its comfortable weight. The teeth were cut deep, edges still sharp despite the years. He didn't know what had opened, but had the sense it had lived in his uncle's pocket for years, maybe most of his life. He set everything aside and pulled the wooden box closer. The sliding latch gave a soft click as he pushed it aside. Lifting the lid, a dry pine, scent rose immediately. Inside was only one thing. A piece of pine no longer than his hand, its surface sanded smooth. Carved deep into it were the words, "Not what you want, but what you must keep." The cuts were clean, steady, the work of a hand that knew its tools and meant every stroke. Daniel held it up, turning it under the light. The resinous sweetness of pine filled his senses, a smell he'd known since he was small. Instantly, memory pulled him back to long ago afternoons. Him standing in the corner of the shop, hands braced on the workbench, watching Uncle Samuel lean over a block of wood, golden light from the west window falling across his shoulders. Sawdust drifted in the sunlight, each speck catching the glow, while the chisel and plane worked in a steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of the room. Back then, he was too young to grasp the meaning behind the pieces his uncle made. But he remembered the way Samuel would rest a hand on a finished piece, narrow his eyes, and exhale slowly, like closing a story only he understood. Now, that small block with its carved words sat in Daniel's palm, heavier than its size allowed. Not what you want, but what you must keep. No explanation, no instructions, yet it struck him straight to the core. He curled his fingers around it, feeling as though he held a promise he'd never spoken, but one his uncle had trusted him to keep. A morning breeze slipped through the crack in the shop door, carrying the sound of dry leaves scudding across the yard. The light through the roof holes fell in golden patches across the dusty floor, some touching the old workbench, others stretching across his scuffed boots. Daniel placed the block back into the box and closed the lid, his hand still holding the faint warmth of the wood. In front of him, the metal key lay silent beside the stack of papers and contracts. Each piece seemed separate, yet Daniel felt there was an unseen thread connecting them. It wasn't clear yet, but like the carving on the block, not what you want, but what you must keep, it was already whispering to him that the road ahead wouldn't just be about an abandoned sawmill. That afternoon, the sky over Ashford hung a soft gray. The clouds stretched thin like a sheet of cloth drifting above the rooftops. Daniel gathered everything, the envelope, the contracts, the notes, the carved pine block, and the small metal key, into a canvas bag, tied it tight, and set on the passenger seat of the pickup. The engine rumbled to life, blending with the crunch of the tires rolling over loose gravel. Elliot Carter lived and worked near the edge of downtown, in the part of town where old red brick buildings still kept their 1940s facades. His office was upstairs in one of them, the wooden door painted moss green, the paint flaking in patches. When Daniel stepped inside, the air carried a mix of paper, stale coffee, and pine from the shelves. A simple smell, not fancy, but steady and familiar. Elliot was behind his desk, silver-rimmed glasses low on his nose, bent over a thick file. He looked up at the sound of footsteps, the corners of his eyes tightening into a rare but warm smile. It's been a while, his eyes seemed to say, though his mouth stayed quiet. Daniel set the canvas bag on the desk, opened it, and laid each item out neatly on the scratched wooden surface. Elliot didn't ask a thing at first. He took off his glasses, wiped them clean, then picked up the first contract. Daylight streamed through the window to his left, spilling across the yellowed pages. He read slowly, as if each word could be either a trap or the key. Now, and then his finger tapped the paper's edge, a habit carried over from his army days, back when he was scanning maps or orders. Daniel stayed still, eyes on every movement. In the quiet, the ticking of the wall clock was sharp and steady. After a few minutes, Elliot set the page down, pulled the next, and then another. When he reached Samuel's handwritten notes, his brows lifted slightly, his eyes lingering longer there. Price manipulation, Elliot said, almost on a breath. His tone was even, without surprise, like a man who had seen this before. He turned the stack, underlined a line of printed text, a wartime lumber transport company, with the tip of his pencil. Then he tapped a faded signature and circled a cluster of numbers in Samuel's notes. This name, he said, tapping the circle, is in business with Frank Miller now. No further detail, no extra words. Just one short sentence, heavy as a stone between them. Daniel didn't press for more. He knew Elliot. If he chose each word this carefully, the rest was serious enough not to be spoken casually. Elliot picked up the key, turned it between his thumb and forefinger, the scratched silver catching the light. Keep everything safe, he said at last. Nothing more. No handschak, no promise. Daniel repacked each item, tied the bag just as it had been. When he stood, Elliot only nodded once, the kind of nod men share after a foxhole or a long night on watch, recognition and trust that needs no explaining. As Daniel stepped down the wooden stairs, each tread gave a low creak. Outside, the light had sharpened, streaks of sun cutting through the thinning clouds. At the truck, he set the bag back on the passenger seat. His hand rested on the knot, feeling the rough twine under his fingertips, hearing again Elliot's words, "Keep everything safe." The engine started, its growl joining the sound of a school bus passing at the end of the block, children's voices spilling from open windows. And in that moment, wrapped in the small-town rhythm, Daniel knew what he carried in that bag wasn't just old paperwork. It was the kind of thing men like Frank Miller would rather bury, and that meant he had to guard it, not just with a length of twine, but with whatever he had left in him. That afternoon, the sky turned heavy gray. A thick layer of clouds spread over the town like a worn blanket. Daniel returned to Whisper Timber Yard, pushing the door open for a draft of cold air to spill in, carrying the smell of damp leaves and wood smoke from somewhere far off. He hung his coat on the rusted hook by the entrance, then stepped deeper into the shop. The light was fading, the pale golden patches on the wooden floor from that morning now replaced by long, overlapping shadows like dark cuts across the room. He was tucking away the things from his meeting with Elliot, the envelope, the wooden box, the key, into a deep drawer at the back of the workbench when the sound of tires crunching over gravel broke the quiet outside. Daniel looked up and walked to the door. A black sedan, polished to a mirror even in the dim afternoon light, rolled slowly into the yard. The door swung open, and Frank Miller stepped out, charcoal wool coat, leather shoes without a speck of dirt. "Daniel," Frank called, lifting his hand, slightly like greeting an old friend. His smile spread wide, but it never touched his eyes. He passed through the gate, his shoes making a sharp, dry sound on the cracked concrete. Inside the shop, Frank's gaze swept the space, the dust-covered planers, the silent saw tables, the musty air mixed with old wood. His brow creased for an instant, then smoothed into a nod meant to look approving. "Place like this must be a headache, huh? Doesn't make money, takes effort to keep up. I know someone could take it off your hand for a good price. Save you the trouble, give you cash for other things." Daniel stayed still, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the bench. He looked at Frank, but said nothing. The silence made Frank tilt his head slightly, as if waiting for the smallest sign of agreement. When none came, he shifted his stance, slid his hands into his coat pockets, and his eyes sharpened. But Frank stepped closer, closing the distance, his voice dropping lower, slower, heavier. "Some things are better left alone, especially if you want to keep seeing your daughter." The words landed without the need for emphasis. At that range, Daniel could hear Frank's breath, could see the way his lips sealed after each phrase, like someone shutting the lid on a box full of secrets. The air between them thickened, as if the room had been drained of oxygen. Daniel didn't answer right away. He felt each of Frank's words like the blow of a hammer, driving in the truth that this wasn't a suggestion. It was a threat wrapped in politeness. Outside, the wind rattled the crooked wooden sign, its creak cutting into the heavy silence. He kept his gaze on Frank's eyes, not dropping it, not to challenge, but to remember. Every detail, every gesture, every slight shift in tone and expression. Frank gave a thin smile, stepped back half a pace, as if he'd said all that needed saying. "Think about it," he said, before turning for the door. The engine started in the yard, tires grinding over gravel again. Daniel stayed where he was, his hands still pressed to the bench, the knuckles gone white. In his mind, Frank's words replayed, each time heavier. But woven through them came another image. The small hand of Emma in his, that first afternoon they'd met again, warm yet hesitant. The joy of holding his daughter, the need to protect that bond. Now, Frank's threat only made that resolve dig in deeper. He shut the drawer, locked it, and stepped to the shop's doorway, standing on the threshold to watch the road Frank had just taken. The sky was still gray, but far to the west, a thin streak of light had torn through the clouds. Night had settled in, and Rachel's house was bathed in the dim golden light from a floor lamp in the corner of the living room. Emma sat at her desk by the window, her math notebook open, a pencil laid across the page, twirling now and then between her fingers. Outside, the night wind hissed softly through the maples, making their shadows sway against the curtains. At first, it was quiet, just the scratch of pencil on paper and the steady tick of the small wall clock. Then, from downstairs, came the quick, decisive sound of footsteps, followed by the living room door closing harder than usual. Emma's head lifted. Frank's voice came next, not loud, but sharp, each word cut clean like it had been shaped with a knife. He still has Samuel's contract, and the paperwork on that shipment. A short silence followed, the kind that felt like Rachel was standing right in front of him, arms folded or eyes turned away. Then Rachel's voice, softer, but urgent. I told you I don't want Emma dragged into this. And those papers, if the police or the press. The sentence broke off, either because Frank cut her off or because she swallowed the rest. Emma felt her heartbeat quicken, the pencil still pinched between her fingers, but no longer marking numbers in her notebook. Frank said something, his tone dropping, but Emma only caught pieces, dangerous, best if, before the words dissolved in the scrape of a chair. Rachel answered, her voice tighter, like she was trying to convince him of something or cover something up. Emma set her pencil down and tilted her head toward the door. The voices slipped through the stairwell's open space, just enough for her to know this wasn't the kind of argument grown-ups had over everyday things. Words like contract, papers, Uncle Samuel, and Daniel stuck in her mind, sharp as puzzle pieces still missing the rest of the picture. Outside the window, a gust of wind puffed the curtain outward, then let it fall. Emma turned back to her desk, but her eyes stayed fixed on the door. She didn't understand the full meaning of what she'd heard, only that her dad's and Uncle Samuel's names were tied to something serious, something that could make Frank and her mom fight. At her age, Emma was old enough to sense when adults were keeping things from her, and it was the silence, the cut-off sentences, that made her curiosity take root. She hesitated, then quickly scribbled in the notebook's margin a few words she could remember, the letters crooked from haste. Contract, Uncle S. Papers, Dad keeps. The voices downstairs kept going, but lower now, nearly a whisper. Emma shut her notebook, stood, walked to the top of the stairs, then stopped. She knew if they caught her listening, it would end right there, and she'd lose her chance to learn more. Instead, she went back to her desk, pretending to work, her ears tuned to the muffled exchange below. Inside, a thought was starting to take shape. If Dad was holding on to something important, and it had to do with Uncle Samuel, maybe, just maybe, that was why Frank looked at him the way he did. And maybe it was also the thing casting a shadow over this family that no one wanted to name. She didn't know what to do yet, but she knew she wouldn't forget. The words she'd written, the voices she'd heard, the look in Frank's eyes whenever Dad came up. She'd keep them all stored away, waiting for the moment she could piece them together. That afternoon, autumn sunlight slanted into Emma's small room, laying a pale yellow carpet across the floor. Rachel was busy out in the yard, and Frank wasn't home. The house was so quiet, Emma could hear the clock ticking on the wall. She was tidying up her bookshelf, partly because her schoolwork had piled up since the start of the year, partly because she wanted to find her old journal. When she pulled open the bottom shelf, a small square wooden box, wedged between stacks of notebooks, tumbled out and slid across the floor. The lid was carved with a simple maple branch, the lines rough but even. Emma knew it instantly. It was the box Grandpa Samuel had made for her mom when she was still a teenager. The hinge gave a small click as she lifted the lid. Inside were a few old coins, a wooden button, and a black USB drive. On its side, faintly etched, was an oak leaf emblem. Emma turned it in her fingers, the cold at her fingertips making her pause. She'd seen that symbol before, yes, on one of the photos Dad kept on his workbench in the sawmill. The room stayed quiet except for the rustle of leaves outside the window. Emma opened her desk drawer and took out the old laptop she still used for school. The screen lit slowly, a dim blue glow washing over her face. She plugged in the USB, and the computer gave a faint hum. One folder appeared, plainly named S.His_audio. She hesitated for a few seconds, then clicked. A single audio file appeared, the date blurred, but the voice that came through the speakers was clear, low, gravelly, with the slow breathing of someone who'd spent years in hard work. If you're hearing this, it means I'm no longer a long pause. The Phantom Lumber contract, they used it to launder money. The names, you already know, but they think they've buried everything. Frank Miller, Vaughn Logistics, 10 years, and the cut still hasn't healed. Emma sat frozen. Every sentence, every name, pulled the threads tighter between the fragments she'd overheard the other night. Her grandfather's voice didn't tremble, but there was something urgent in its tone. The recording lasted less than 3 minutes, ending with 3 knocks, like a private signal. She pulled the USB out and gripped it in her hand. Her heart was pounding, not from fear, but from knowing this was something Dad needed to hear. She wasn't always sure she was doing the right thing, but this time, she didn't doubt it. Emma found a small plastic bag, slipped the USB inside, and hid it under a folded sweater in the top drawer of her closet. She knew if Frank or her mother found it, it would be gone. Outside, the light had softened, and the shadow of the maple tree stretched long across the wall. Emma stood looking at the closed closet door, feeling as though she'd just put a crucial puzzle piece in place, though the picture was still unfinished. In her mind, she saw her dad, standing at the school gate that day, eyes waiting, his hand warm but slow to close around hers. Emma pressed her lips together. She would find a way to give this to him, no matter how long it took, no matter how many watchful eyes she had to slip past. The brief joy of seeing her dad again would only survive if it was protected. And now, she carried that resolve herself. Saturday afternoon. A thin layer of clouds hung over the town, pale light filtering through the leaves and spilling onto quiet streets, still carrying the scent of roasted coffee from the corner cafe. Emma, in her frayed hem blue sweater, stepped out of the house with a small canvas crossbody bag. She told her mother she was heading to the bookstore to look for a new novel, her voice as light as on any other ordinary afternoon. Rachel only nodded, asking nothing more. The walk into town was still. The early winter breeze carried a hint of chill, tossing a few wisps of hair against her cheek. Emma passed the familiar row of shop fronts, their bakery windows reflecting her small figure, before turning onto the street where Maple and Pine Cafe stood. As the glass door opened, the chime tinkled softly, and the air filled with the blend of coffee and old pine wood from the paneled counter. Daniel was already at a table in the corner, his back to the wall, so he could see the whole room. His olive coat hung on the back of his chair, hair slightly tousled, eyes fixed on the window as though waiting for someone. When the door clicked shut, his gaze found Emma instantly. No wide smile, just a softening at the corners of his eyes, a warmth carried deep. Emma walked over, the bag swaying lightly at her hip. She didn't say a word. From inside, she pulled out a black USB drive and placed it on the dark wooden table. The sound it made hitting the surface was faint, but to Daniel it felt like the weight of a stone slab being set down. The light from the window caught the faintly etched oak leaf emblem on its side. She looked up at him. Emma's blue eyes didn't need words, but held an entire sentence. I trust you. Not blind trust, but one piece together from the fragments she'd gathered. The overheard conversation, the wooden box, her grandfather's recorded voice. A trust quiet but anchored, like roots buried deep in cold earth. Daniel's gaze lingered on her longer than it needed to. For a moment, every sound in the cafe, the clink of spoons and porcelain, the door opening, orders being called, faded to background. All that remained was her small hand resting near the USB, and the certainty that this moment outweighed any verdict he'd ever stood to hear in uniform. He reached out, not rushing, and set his hand over hers. The calloused fingers shaped by wood and war wrapped around her slender ones, gripping just enough to say he understood, he accepted, and he would not let this be forgotten. They sat there in stillness. No immediate questions. No, where did you find it? Or who knows about this? Because those could wait. What mattered now was holding on to this exact moment. The moment trust was given, along with the weight of responsibility it carried. Outside, the clouds thickened and the light thinned, but in that corner of Maple and Pine, something had been lit. Emma lifted her cup of warm milk, Daniel his coffee, and together they listened to the soft, steady clink of spoon against cup, the quiet rhythm of a shared promise not to back down. Daniel knew well. The joy of sitting across from his daughter could only last if he protected her, and protected the truth inside that small USB. And in Emma's eyes, he saw he wasn't alone in the fight anymore. Night had settled over the town. The street where Elliot Carter's small office stood as still as if the thin layer of fog had frozen every movement in place. Daniel parked the pickup along the curb, cut the engine, and let the cooling hum fade into a thick silence. He opened the door, his hand tightening around the USB in his coat pocket, and stepped into the warm yellow light of the office. The place hadn't changed since his last visit. Tall wooden bookshelves, a broad desk stacked with files, a framed county map hanging on the left wall. The air held the mix of paper, stale coffee, and the faint oak scent from the old floorboards, a blend that felt both familiar and weighted. Elliot sat at the desk, sleeves rolled up, glasses set beside his stack of documents. When Daniel walked in, he simply looked up and gave a small nod, like he'd been expecting him. Daniel didn't waste words. He pulled the USB from his pocket, set it on the desk, and let his fingers rest on it for a beat before letting go. Elliot slotted it into his computer. The screen lit, casting a pale blue glow across both their faces. One folder appeared, the same name Daniel had seen that afternoon, S.Hayes_audio. Elliot opened the file. There was a faint hiss of static. Then Samuel Hayes's voice came through, rough, broken by a few coughs. If you're hearing this, then my time's run out. The Phantom Lumber contract, that's just the surface. The rest is in shipments no paper ever recorded. The names, Frank Miller, Vaughn Logistics, and those higher up. They think they've erased it all. He paused, catching his breath before going on. 10 years. Eva stayed silent. But someone has to finish this. Daniel leaned against the desk's edge, eyes fixed on the screen though his mind had slipped somewhere else, back to, when he was 10, standing beside Uncle Samuel in the sawmill, the smell of pine resin and the steady pull of the saw. That voice now carried a different weight. Not a craftsman's tale, but the dying confession of a man who'd held on to too much for too long. Elliot sat back, his gaze leaving the screen and settling on Daniel. The computer's glow caught in his eyes, sharpening them. We're going to bring this into the light, he said, not loudly, but with each word carved into the space between them. Daniel gave a small nod. No flare of emotion, just a quiet heat rising in his chest. He knew that once those names saw daylight, there'd be no turning back. And he knew just as surely that every small joy he'd had with Emma, an afternoon in the cafe, that silent squeeze of her hand, would only survive if he saw this through. Elliot pulled the USB free, slipped it into an anti-static pouch, zipped it shut, and placed it in the small safe in the corner. From now on, every step has to be solid. They won't just sit still. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing even the streetlights. Through the office window, Daniel saw their reflections side by side, two lines running parallel into a fight neither could step away from. Inside, the safe shut with a single crisp click. A full stop, but not an ending, just the first mark in the work of pulling everything from the dark into the light, no matter the cost. Rumors began the way they always do in a town like this. Vague, source unknown, but persistent enough to slip through every diner, corner store, and gas station. People whispered that Daniel Hayes was holding on to some important papers of Uncle Samuel's, that big names were involved, that he refused to let go. No one said it outright, but the looks he got walking into the grocery store carried a different weight, part curiosity, part unease. One gray afternoon, wind swept through the bare maples out front, and Frank Miller appeared. He didn't knock, just pushed open the old iron gate with a metallic screech, and walked in like he belonged here more than the owner did. Charcoal suit, tie straight, shoes polished to the point of reflecting the faint light slipping through the gaps in the tin roof. Daniel was oiling an old handplane, the one he'd kept since his apprentice days with Samuel. The smell of oil mixed with the scent of rotting wood, heavy but familiar. He looked up and met Frank's eyes. Frank wasted no time. Rumors travel fast, Daniel, he said, voice smooth but edged. Word is you're holding something that doesn't belong to you. Daniel didn't answer right away. He set the plane down, wiped his hands on a rag, and stepped closer, keeping just enough space between them. Frank smiled, but stopped at his mouth, never touching his eyes. You know, he went on, this town runs on relationships. And relationships, they're fragile. especially when people start digging up old files. Say a veteran's psychological records, for example. The hint landed in the air like the slice of a thin blade. Daniel felt each word, each implication, those post-service evaluations, the notes that could be twisted into an excuse to strip him of his right to see Emma. Frank didn't need to spell it out. The message was whole. Walk away or lose your daughter. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the wooden door. Daniel kept his eyes steady, shoulders squared. His voice was low and deliberate. I'm not selling the mill. For words, but they landed like a boulder across the path Frank was trying to clear. The silence afterward was thick enough to hear dry leaves skittering across the concrete outside. Frank studied him for a long moment, as if weighing whether to play another card. Then he gave a short laugh and stepped back. You hold on to this pile of rotten timber, Frank said, his voice less polished now. But don't forget, everything has a price. He turned and crossed the moss-patched yard, his shoes still gleaming under the dim gray of late afternoon. Daniel watched him until the iron gate closed with clang. In his chest, his heartbeat was steady and slow, as if reminding himself he wouldn't back down. That answer wasn't just a refusal. It was a commitment, to himself, to the mill, and most of all, to Emma. Daniel went back to the bench, picking up the cloth and working the oil into the old planed surface. The mix of wood and oil didn't erase the echo of the confrontation, but it reminded him there were still things he could keep, so long as he didn't let go. Joy wouldn't survive on its own. It needed protecting, even if that meant facing the rawest threats head-on. Evening settled over Rachel's house in the tired yellow light of the ceiling lamp, casting a soft circle on the carpet. Early winter air slipped through the narrow gap of a half-closed window, making the curtain puff gently like a chest trying to hold steady. The scent of vanilla candle wax mixed with laundry soap lingering in clothes drying by the heater. Pleasant, but with a faint sense of suffocation. Frank came home late. The turn of a key, the sure rhythm of shoes on wood. He hung his coat, smoothed his cuffs, then set a leather-bound folder on the coffee table. Without preamble, he opened it, pulling out a handful of color prints. Photos of bright stone buildings, manicured lawns, a row of dormitories with steep roofs, the school's name in neat serif letters printed in the corner. Another folder held class schedules, boarding regulations, a fee sheet. The paper was pristine, the edges still sharp. Rachel came in from the kitchen, hands still carrying the scent of soap. She stopped a few steps from the table, not sitting, looking at the pages like they were a window to somewhere else. A slight crease formed on her forehead. Her fingers idly turned the thin band on her ring finger. The light made the faint shadows under her eyes more pronounced. Frank slid one sheet toward her, not pressing, not smiling, just the practiced motion of someone used to laying out the best option. His fingertip rested on the corner, as if nailing it invisibly to the table. In the kitchen, the kettle had boiled and clicked off, steam still curling above the stove. Rachel poured a little into a cup, set it down, but didn't drink. She leafed through the pages, her eyes scanning phrases about safe learning environment, separate campus, arts, and athletics program. Words crisp and clean, smelling of fresh ink. But beneath them, she felt an unnamed hollow. She thought of Emma, the blue sweater folded on the chair, shoes lined neatly by the door, a book left open on the bed, page corner folded. She remembered the warmth of her daughter's small hand in hers years ago, restless like a living leaf. The thought of a far-off dorm room without the scent of familiar detergent, without the sound of maple branches brushing the window, clenched something in her chest. Frank didn't raise his voice, but his words fell onto the thick carpet with weight. For her good, safe there, kept out of things she shouldn't be near. Each phrase set down neatly, straight and cold. He pointed to a dot on the printed map. The campus, over 8 hours' drive from town. His finger lingered on it, pressing as if marking a spot he already knew well. Rachel looked at him. For a second, her expression shifted, as if someone had pulled back a curtain. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Phrases like she's too young, alone so far away, rose in her throat but stuck there, dry and heavy. Across from her, Frank's eyes were as still as a frozen lake, flat, bottomless. That stillness bent every protest into something emotional. She sat down. The cup of hot water had cooled halfway. The vanilla from the candle was suddenly too sweet, making her tongue tingle faintly. She folded one sheet of paper, aligning its edges. Silence stretched, then tightened again. Finally, she gave a small nod, an old reflex like a damp cloth laid over a fire. Upstairs, Emma sat on the third step from the top, knees pulled to her chest. The carpet was soft, but the wooden banister was cold and slick from polish. She heard the rustle of papers, the clink of a spoon against porcelain, and words breaking into shards. Boarding, safe zone, avoid entanglement, leave it be. They fit together like pieces of shattered glass, clear and sharp, impossible to pick up without cutting yourself. She couldn't see her mother's face from the stairs, only her shadow on the wall, thin, bowed slightly. Frank's shadow stood straight, steady, leaning toward the table now and then like a fixed marker. The house, once familiar, suddenly felt like a train platform where people were about to part ways. Emma thought of the black USB hidden under the top sweater in her closet, of her father's silent hand clasp at Maple and Pine. From deep in her stomach, a coldness climbed in her chest, then thinned out into her throat. She didn't understand the full plan, but she knew one thing. If she ended up far away, with perfect lawns and spotless stone walls, she'd have no way to bring her grandfather's voice to her dad, no way to stand near the sawmill with the patched tin roof, where the smell of old pine clung to his coat like a promise. Rachel stood to gather the papers, her hand trembling slightly. One sheet slipped, gliding onto the carpet and stopping at the chair leg. She bent to pick it up, too quickly, her shoulder flinching. Frank stayed silent, placing everything back in the folder, snapping the clasp, and setting it down like a stone blocking a path. Emma stepped back into the hallway shadows. She could hear the clock ticking, each beat like a small hammer tapping would. In her head, a map began to take shape. When her mother usually came into her room, when Frank stepped outside for calls, how the back latch stuck a little, and a hooded coat hanging on the second hook from the left. The map had no safe route, only possible ones. She went to her room, opened the closet, lifted the top sweater. The USB was still there, compact, cold. She slid it into a small cloth pouch, looped the string around her neck, tucked it under her shirt. She touched it once, feeling the solid shape over her heart, then let her hand fall. Downstairs, Rachel blew out the candle. The vanilla scent vanished abruptly, leaving a hollow without smell or taste. The papers lay bundled on the table, sealed. Frank drew the curtains, cutting the room's light in half. Emma sat on the edge of her bed, legs swinging above the floor. Her gaze rested on the fabric backpack hanging in the corner, imagining what she'd pack: a light jacket, the unfinished book, a small water bottle, a few bills in an old envelope. In her mind, her grandfather's recorded voice still echoed. The names, the shadowed roads, the undocumented shipments. And under it, deeper, the crisp, steady sound of a plane gliding over wood, a second heartbeat of the town. Night outside deepened. A car passed, its headlights sweeping the wall in a thin beam before fading. Emma lay down, pulling the blanket to her chest, eyes open in the dark her vision had already adjusted to. She didn't cry. Something else was growing in place of tears, a small but unyielding will, like the pine block carved with Uncle Samuel's words. Not what you want, but what you must keep. She closed her eyes, counting the clock's ticks, waiting for the house to slip into its final quiet. When the lights went out, when the pipes stopped running, when Frank's footsteps fell into a steady, distant rhythm. Then, on a night not far off, she'd leave through the back door, lifting it slightly to keep the latch from squeaking, carrying the small pouch against her chest. She'd walk toward the one person who could turn a recording into light, and that light into a place where joy could stay. The house had sunk into the heavy stillness of the hours after midnight, when even the wind seemed to slow. The living room light had been off for hours, leaving only the faint yellow glow of the kitchen nightlamp, casting a small circle onto the tiled floor. Emma stood in the darkness of her room, listening as if any sound could give her away. Her canvas backpack had been set out on the bed since the afternoon. She had packed each item with care: a thin sweater, a beige scarf, the book folded at page 132, a small plastic water bottle, and an envelope holding a few loose bills she'd found in her desk drawer. The black USB sat snug in her coat pocket, right over her chest, making her feel weighed down and reassured all at once. She put on the coat, looped the small pouch's string around her neck, and pulled the zipper up to her chin. Her fingers brushed the pocket once, confirming it was still there, then gripped the backpack straps. A slow breath. Out in the hall, the wall clock gave a soft tick. This was the moment. Stepping onto the first stair, she shifted her weight to her toes to avoid the creak. The carpet on the steps was thick but not enough to swallow all sound, so she paused more than once, waiting for longer silences before moving again. Below, the window by the porch cast a sliver of moonlight, silvering the floating dust like a fine rain suspended in air. At the bottom step, she caught the hiss of wind outside. The kitchen was quiet, still scented with the afternoon's baking, underlaid with dish soap. Passing the dining table, she glimpsed the folder Frank had left out earlier, black cover fastened tight, edges worn. She didn't slow, stopping meant staying. At the back door, she tested the latch. The hinge gave a faint squeal, sharp in the night. She remembered her own rule. Lift the door slightly as you push so the latch doesn't scrape wood. The second try opened without a sound. Cold air poured in, carrying the smell of damp earth and rotted leaves after an early rain. Her breath rose in a thin cloud and vanished. Outside, the yard lay under a film of mist. The shadow of the old maple stretched across the grass, its bare branches like arms reaching to hold her back. The narrow path to the alley was a patchwork of darkness, with only the weak street lamp at the far end as a guide. Emma pulled her hood up, stepped down the porch steps, and felt the cold, damp ground under her shoes. She didn't run, but walked quickly, keeping her pace even. Her heart thudded, not from fear, but from knowing she was crossing the line between thought and action. Upstairs, Rachel's room was dark. The curtains stirred faintly in the draft from the half-open window, but there was no other sound. Frank was surely still asleep in his own room, breathing heavily like machinery. Emma crossed the small yard and touched the wooden gate. The lock was rusted, but it had long been for show. A light push, and the hinge's groan was swallowed by the wind. She slipped into the back lane, gravel crunching underfoot. This narrow alley would lead to the main street and then to the town's bus stop. With each step, the distance from the house, with its pressed-down conversations and unreadable glances, grew longer, lighter. In her pocket, the USB lay as if alive, breathing with her heartbeat. At the corner, the street lamp pooled its light on the rising mist. She stopped for a moment, glancing back. The house was now just another dark roofline among others, no sign of life inside. She turned, zipped her coat higher, and kept going. The bus stop appeared at the end of the street. A weathered tin roof, a cold metal bench. The timetable sign swayed faintly in the wind. She sat, hugging her bag, eyes on the empty road. Her palms were icy, but she didn't loosen her hold. Each distant hum of an engine made her lift her head, waiting for headlights to swing around the bend. The night bus arrived, its tires whispering over damp asphalt. The door opened, spilling warm yellow light like a shallow pool. She stepped aboard, dropped a few coins in the slot, and found a seat by the window. The bus shuddered forward, the outside world smearing into moving shadows. Through the glass, the sparse line of street lamps retreated behind her. She leaned her forehead against the cold pane, her breath fogging a small patch. For a moment, she pictured her father's face when he saw her, the scent of old wood in the workshop, the light falling through the patched tin roof. The image kept her eyes open, though her lids grew heavy. The bus carried her out of town, through stretches of road where only wind and the steady engine broke the silence. In the seat's shadow, she gripped the pouch string and didn't let go. Outside, the red blink of the next stop flashed and vanished. Each mile brought her closer to her father's warm hand, closer to handing over the one thing that could change everything. When the bus entered the city center, late-night storefronts glowed against the dark. She got off at the main terminal, the cold rushing back. From here, it was only a few streets to the cafe near the school, where her father had once waited. But tonight, she'd find somewhere bright and crowded to stay until morning, somewhere she could make a call without being recognized. Emma stepped into a convenience store blazing with light, the smell of brewed coffee mixing with fresh pastries. She chose a cup of hot chocolate and took a seat by the window. Outside, the night stretched on, but inside her chest, a small flame was burning. A flame lit by the resolve to protect what must be kept, and by the thought that, if she waited just a few more hours, she would see her father's eyes in the early morning light, amid the scent of wood and the glow of gold. Dawn was nearing, the interstate a gray ribbon shading into lead beneath the headlights. Daniel gripped the wheel tighter, watching the dashboard clock tick forward minute by minute. Inside the truck, only the engine's hum and the wind whistling through the door seams broke the silence, steady, taut, like a rope pulled to its limit. The call from a neighboring town's police station still rang in his head, short but enough to send heat pounding in his temples. "Are you Daniel Hayes? We have a girl here, Emma Hayes, at the interstate bus terminal. She says she wants to see you immediately. She refuses to return home. No questions, no hesitation. His only answer had been, I'm on my way. Night stretched along the road. Bare roadside trees leaned in the wind, their shadows sweeping across the windshield. He passed sleeping small towns, neon signs gone dark, gas stations standing silent. Each highway sign, counting down the miles to the bus terminal, was another uneven heartbeat in his chest. Turning onto the avenue leading in, the streetlights thinned but glowed warmer, as if announcing a pause in the journey. The terminal lot was quiet, a few buses parked at angles, a lone coffee stand lit up. He braked harder than necessary, tires whispering on the damp asphalt, and killed the engine. Through the glass of the terminal, he saw a small figure on a metal bench, hood pulled low. As he stepped inside, Emma looked up. In that moment, the weariness of the drive blew away like dust in a gust of wind. She sprang to her feet, canvas bag sliding from her shoulder, and ran to him. Her small footsteps echoed on the tile, quick and certain. Daniel opened his arms, and she pressed into him as if letting go would dissolve everything. I don't want to go far. Her voice caught, breath warm against his coat. Daniel bent, wrapping her fully in his arms, feeling the urgent, quick rhythm of her heartbeat. I have something from Uncle Samuel. The words landed in his ear like a light but deep tap. He loosened his hold enough to see her face. From her coat pocket, Emma pulled a small black USB, its surface marked with a faint groove he recognized instantly. Samuel's handwork. He didn't speak, just nodded, and slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat, the reflex of a man safeguarding something precious. His hand closed on her shoulder, steady as any spoken promise. A young police officer came over, handing him a few sheets of notes and a temporary statement. She says she'll only go home with you, the officer said, voice both firm and gentle. Daniel signed where needed, never taking his eyes off Emma. Once done, he placed her bag in the back seat, opened the passenger door, and she climbed in, buckling herself in with one hand while clutching her coat with the other. He started the truck and pulled back toward the highway. They were quiet for the first few miles. Sodium light from the high street lamps brushed across Emma's face, revealing eyes tired yet lit with something deeper. Daniel recognized it. Not just relief at seeing him, but the brightness of someone who had stepped into something larger than herself. On a stretch of empty road, he slowed slightly and glanced over. She was staring out the window, her hand resting over the spot where the USB had been. Small gesture, but it spoke more than a full telling. He turned his gaze forward again. Warmth spread from the passenger seat, from Emma's presence, but beneath it was a sharper edge, the steel point of a need to protect. In that moment, he knew. It wasn't just the lumberyard, not just Samuel's memory. It was this moment, this person beside him, that he had to keep safe whatever the cost. They left the city lights, the gold glow of the terminal falling away behind them. In the east, the sky was paling, the first wash of dawn. Daniel felt lighter, not because home was near, but because he knew he no longer traveled alone. Emma had made her choice, and he would not let it be in vain. When their town appeared on the horizon, he looked over at her once more. She had fallen asleep, head against the glass, breathing steady. In his coat pocket, the USB pulsed like a second heartbeat, in rhythm with his own, reminding him. The joy reclaimed would last only if he could stand firm enough to protect it. The early autumn morning was still heavy with mist when Daniel's pickup turned onto the road leading to the mill. White veils of fog clung to the grass, and a light breeze set the old wooden signs creaking. Emma sat close beside him, a knit cap covering most of her hair, both hands wrapped around the travel mug Daniel had handed her when they left the house. Neither had spoken since leaving town, but the silence wasn't heavy. It felt like the pause you take before stepping into something important. The mill's iron gate was already ajar. Inside, Elliot Carter's figure stood clear in the cold haze. He was upright in a dark gray overcoat that reached nearly to his mud-stained boots, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a coffee cup. On the large wooden table in the center of the room sat the black USB drive, a stack of papers, and a steaming stainless steel coffee pot. Daniel pushed the door open, the hinges groaning into the quiet space. The scent of old wood, machine oil, and coffee mingled in the air, both strange and familiar. Elliot nodded in greeting, his gaze shifting from Daniel to Emma, then back to the table. Right on time, he said quietly, his voice low and steady, like embers murmuring in a stove. Emma pulled out a chair beside the table, It gave a soft, complaining creak under a light weight. Daniel took the seat opposite Elliot, leaning forward slightly, his hand resting close to the USB. Elliot poured coffee into 3 mugs, the heat curling into the cool morning air. He didn't start right away. His eyes moved over the documents laid out before them. Timber contracts, Samuel's handwritten notes, several photocopies of bank statements with suspicious transfers. Beside them, the USB lay motionless, like a small but heavy stone. Only when he was sure he had both their attention did Elliot begin. "What we have here," he tapped the papers, then lightly drummed his fingers on the USB, "is evidence. But evidence only matters if it's taken to the right place. This morning, I spoke to the county prosecutor's office. They have a process: intake, sealing, verifying the chain of custody." Emma stayed still, her eyes fixed on Elliot's hands as he arranged the papers. His tone didn't rise, didn't dramatize. "We'll have to sign a handover report. From that moment on, it'll be out of our hands, and someone will go over every detail. During that process, the names involved will find out." Daniel drew a slow breath. He'd been in situations before where the other side knew exactly what he was holding and wanted it more than anything. But this time was different, because Emma was here beside him, and what lay on the table could just as easily destroy him as save him. Elliot glanced at Emma, then back to Daniel. There might be a reaction. Could be silence. Could be direct. You need to be ready. He wasn't trying to scare them, just setting the compass to the true bearing. Emma took a small sip of coffee and set the cup down without making a sound. Daniel could tell she was holding back questions, but her eyes were full of them. He laid his hand on the table, close to hers, and a slight nod was enough for her to know that everything she'd done so far had been right. Elliot pulled over a thick manila envelope and began stacking each piece inside: the contract, the notes, the bank records, and finally the USB. He sealed it, wrote a series of numbers across the flap with a marker, and signed. "From here on, we won't be able to open it. And if anyone asks, this is everything we know." A draft slipped through the doorway, rattling the dust covers hanging in the far corner. Daniel's mind flicked back to the image of Uncle Samuel bent over his workbench, sunlight slanting through the window on a hands coated in sawdust. Back then, he hadn't understood why a man would hold on to things that didn't make him money. Now he did. Some things, if you don't keep them, no one will. When everything was ready, Elliot slid the mugs toward Daniel and Emma, looking at them both. "I'll go with you. None of us should do this alone." Daniel answered with a simple, firm nod. They sat a few minutes more, no one speaking. The ticking of the old wall clock and the smell of fresh coffee seeped into the grain of the wood, marking the morning when things began to leave the shadows. Emma turned her cup slowly, watching the steam spiral upward, as if she could see a long road ahead, both daunting and exciting, but one she was determined to walk. Daniel lifted the envelope, feeling not just the weight of the papers inside, but of every choice that had led here. He knew from this moment there was no turning back, and he also knew no one in that room wanted to. The courtroom that morning carried a familiar scent of polished wood and old paper, a smell Daniel remembered from military hearings, except here no one wore uniforms, and the only weapon was words. Wooden benches lined both sides, a few curious townsfolk scattered among them. In the center, the judge's bench sat a step higher, sunlight from the tall rear windows falling directly onto the wooden gavel resting on the desk. Daniel sat at the table to the left, Elliot beside him, shuffling the file in order. Emma was right behind her father, her legs swinging to tap lightly against the seat. Across the aisle, Frank wore a charcoal suit, top button fastened, his face unreadable. Rachel sat next to him, her makeup flawless, but her eyes avoiding Daniel's whenever he looked over. The judge, an older man with silver hair, opened the session in a slow, resonant voice. "We are here to hear a petition regarding modification of custody for the minor, Emma Hayes." Every whisper in the room immediately ceased. Frank's attorney was the first to stand, his tone steady, edged. "Your Honor, we have in hand Mr. Daniel Hayes's military records, indicating a prior diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder during his service. We contend that this condition presents a potential risk to providing a stable environment for a child." He set the printed file on the judge's bench, his hand pressing deliberately on the marked pages. Daniel kept his gaze forward, but his heartbeat was hard and fast. He'd heard this line before, was used to people framing his present inside the shadow of his past. Elliot placed a light hand on his arm, a small gesture that pulled his breath back into rhythm. When their turn came, Elliot rose and opened a thin folder. Your Honor, we have a letter from Mr. Hayes's treating psychologist of the last 5 years, confirming his condition is stable with no signs of recurrence, and that he is fully capable of caring for his daughter. We also note that a diagnosis of PTSD cannot automatically be grounds for stripping parental rights. He handed the document to the court clerk. His voice didn't rise or rush, but each word landed with the weight of a nail driven into wood. Then he added, more importantly, Emma Hayes herself will explain the reason she left her mother's and stepfather's home. A beat of silence hung in the air. The judge gave a small nod toward Emma, indicating she could take the witness stand. She walked slowly, one hand gripping the hem of her coat. Standing at the microphone, she lifted her gaze, found her father for a second, then turned to the judge. Her voice was small but clear. I didn't leave home because I was afraid of my dad. I left because Mom and Uncle Frank said they'd send me to a school far away, where I didn't know anyone, and I didn't want to go. I also wanted to know the truth about Uncle Samuel. At home, whenever I asked, they told me to be quiet or got angry at me. The air in the room seemed to settle lower. Frank shifted in his chair, but didn't interrupt. Rachel bowed her head, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Elliot didn't smile, but Daniel caught the faint light in his eyes. Emma swallowed once, then finished. I want to live with my dad because he listens to me, and he doesn't make me forget the things I think are important. The judge studied her for several moments before motioning for her to return to her seat. The soft sound of her footsteps back to the bench felt, to Daniel, like firm knocks against the courtroom floor. Each step a statement, each step a defense for them both. Elliot requested to submit an additional handwritten statement Emma had written the night she arrived at the bus station. The judge accepted it, skimmed the page, and nodded. The opposing counsel had no further questions. Frank sat still, though his shoulders seemed a shade more rigid, as if realizing the shield he'd brought into this room was no longer whole. Daniel glanced at Emma, and this time, she turned to meet him, flashing a thin, quick smile, just enough to dissolve the weight in his chest. He understood, then, that no matter the outcome, they had crossed a line from which nothing could pull them back. The faint rustle of the small USB as Elliot slid into the player carried through the courtroom like a signal for everyone to hold their breath. On the screen to the right of the judge, a single progress bar appeared. No images, only the sound of a hoarse voice, occasionally broken by short, shallow coughs. March 12th. Uncle Samuel's voice came through, each word slow, deliberate, stripped of any hint of invention. Lumber shipment number 47 does not exist on the mill's official paperwork, yet appears on the transport manifest to Fort Randall. Frank Miller's name on the inspection line, a hand-signed subcontract from Vernon and Sons, payment routed through Costerfield Bank, account registered to Marcus Doyle. A few murmurs rippled through the gallery. The judge raised a hand for silence, his eyes never leaving the screen. The audio went on, this time the sound of pages being turned, then Samuel's voice reading off each figure, each detail only someone inside the trade, and inside the plot, would know. Shipment weights, container numbers, dates, times, and even penciled side notes beside ledger entries. All of these contracts, the voice slowed, have been copied and hidden in the locked compartment at Whisper Timber Yard. If anyone finds them, know that I kept them not for money, but for the day truth needed a place to stand. When the recording ended, the room was filled only with the steady hum of the ventilation fan and the quiet tap of the judge's pen against the bench. Elliot said nothing else. He simply pulled the USB free and slipped it into the case folder in front of him, like a man who knew he had just done his part. The judge leaned back in his chair, fingers interlaced, his gaze sweeping slowly across the room. This evidence, he said evenly, concerns individuals and entities still active in this community, including the petitioner in this custody dispute. It will be forwarded to the proper authorities for a separate investigation. However, he paused, his eyes settling first on Daniel, then on Emma. Within the scope of my authority today, I find that Mr. Daniel Hayes is not only not a danger to his child, but is in fact the person this child trusts to safeguard her own interests. The gavel struck once a crisp, definitive sound. The court awards temporary custody of Emma Hayes to Mr. Daniel Hayes for the next 3 months. During this period, the mother and stepfather may visit according to a set schedule, but may not remove the child from the locality without Mr. Hayes's written consent. For a moment, no one spoke. Rachel's head was bowed, her hands clenched tightly around her handbag, her hair hiding most of her face. Frank sat motionless, his eyes vacant, as if every calculation had dropped into a void. Daniel could hear only his own breathing, heavy but deep, like the breath you take after a long run when the finish marker finally comes into view. Emma turned to her father, her eyes bright but restrained, like she understood this was a joy that had to be kept inside, safe from prying hands. Daniel gave a slight nod, a small movement that was enough for both of them to know this was only the beginning. The judge closed his folder and signaled the clerk to have the USB's contents entered into the official record. Elliot leaned toward Daniel, speaking just low enough for him to hear. "First step. We've still got work to do." Daniel answered with a light squeeze of the case folder in his hand. Inside it lay the things that could end more than just a custody case. From the far side of the room, a shaft of light cut in through the tall window, stretching long shadows of Daniel and Emma across the wooden floor. Those two shadows now stood so close. There was no space left between them. Tuesday afternoon, a thin veil of gray cloud hung over the town, muting the light that fell across steep rooftops and the main street, a place where almost nothing ever seemed to change. In the back room of the community law office, Elliot sat at an old wooden table, leafing through each file one last time. Yellowed sheets, sprawling signatures, blurred notary stamps, all pressed into slim bundles, alongside the USB containing Samuel's recorded statement and copies of the forged contracts. The room was still but for the crisp, deliberate sound of Elliot's pen marking the face of a large envelope. Daniel stood by the window, eyes fixed on the birch trees outside, swaying gently in the wind. He could hear every scrape of paper, every pull of packing tape, the sounds marking a step they could never walk back from. "Done," Elliot said, his voice low and steady. He set 3 envelopes on the table, one addressed to the federal court, one to the largest investigative newspaper in the state, and one to the Department of Justice. Daniel didn't need it spelled out. This was the moment Samuel's story would leave the small circle of those who had carried it in secret and step fully into public light. They walked to the main post office, a red brick building on the corner where the wall clock ticked loud enough to hear from the counter. The clerk took the envelopes and stamped them with a heavy metal dater, each thump of the seal landing with a solid finality. When the envelopes disappeared through the swinging door to the back, Daniel felt as if he had just handed over a piece of himself. 2 mornings later, Whisper Timber Yards Day began with the desk phone ringing again and again. Elliot was pouring coffee when Daniel walked in from the shop floor, his gloves hooked over the rim of his hard hat. He picked up the receiver. The voice on the other end was brisk, professional, calling from a major newsroom. "Mr. Hayes, we're running a piece on the ghost lumber contracts in Brookfield County. Sources confirm you hold most of the documentation. We'd like to interview you." Daniel glanced at Elliot, who gave the smallest of nods. He answered slowly, each word landing like a hammer against a joiner's bench. "I'll speak, but only about what I know and what I can prove." By noon, the paper had rushed out an early edition. Across the front page, a photograph of Whisper Timber Yard's faded gates and its leaning wooden sign stood above the headline. The Ghost Lumber Network in Brookfield County, from forgotten legacy to shattering allegations. The article didn't just recount details from the files. It traced threads between powerful local names and wartime shadow deals. Daniel's cell phone lit up without pause. Unknown numbers, out-of-town area codes, the voices of reporters, of former mill workers, and of strangers who just wanted to share their own fragments of the story. Some calls carried support. Others spoke only a few clipped sentences before hanging up, leaving a half-empty silence behind. By late afternoon, sunlight slanted through the shop's doorway, striking a tabletop cluttered with dusty papers. Emma sat at one corner, bent over her math homework, glancing up at her father every so often. Daniel took another call, but each time his eyes fell on her, he remembered the true reason behind all of this. Elliot set a steaming mug of coffee in front of him, his gaze sharp. "They'll come. Not just the reporters. People who don't want this story breathing." Daniel nodded, tightening his grip on the mug's handle. The heat seeped through the ceramic into his fingers, grounding him. He knew that once the article was printed, there was no way back. And he knew, too, that what Samuel had left behind was no longer just an inheritance or a burden. It had become a promise to his daughter that the truth would not be buried. In the days after the story broke, Brookfield changed. Not in a loud, dramatic way. More like a still lake getting ripples from somewhere deep below. On Main Street, Frank Miller's office windows weren't wide open anymore. The blinds were drawn halfway, dust gathering along the frames. One morning, folks saw an employee out front taking down the partner plaque from beside the door. Old screws dropped to the sidewalk with a dry little clink. Those constant phone calls begging for an appointment? Now they came as one-line texts, cold as the edge of a sharpened pencil. Postponing business for now. At the diner on the corner, where people still read the paper over weak coffee, somebody slapped their folded copy down on the counter, the headline about the phantom lumber contracts, now tucked beside a half-eaten slice of toast. The authorities showed up quiet. No sirens, no flashing lights. Just a few dark sedans parked neat against the curb. Men and women in long coats stepping out with the kind of purpose you don't fake. They flashed credentials as quick as a mechanic closing a toolbox. They went to the storage yards on the edge of town, the shipping office down the South Hill, the bank at 4th and Main. They took notes, snapped pictures, sealed folders with red tape. By afternoon, the sunlight through the windows hit that tape just right, making it look like a clean line under the name of something everyone thought was untouchable. News traveled the old-fashioned way, through the post office, the gas station, the barber shop. No one knew everything, but everyone knew enough to look at each other a second longer. Frank didn't lose his footing all at once. He lost it handshake by handshake, meeting by meeting, door by door. Appointments got pushed back, then quietly erased from the calendar. I figure his desk still had the faint ring from a coffee cup, but fewer and fewer people were there to share it. Rachel left one foggy morning. The neighbors said she carried a worn suitcase to the car, shut the door gently. None of the sharp clicks you heard after one of their fights. The engine started, white exhaust curling away in the cold air. In the kitchen, her coffee mug still had a rim of brown at the bottom, the heat barely gone. No one knew where she went, just that she went alone. The house sat quiet, like after a long cough finally dies out. The court's decision came in a thick envelope that smelled of fresh ink. Elliot was standing with Daniel at the post office counter when the clerk handed it over. He tore it open right there, under the scratch glass where folks signed for their mail and bought stamps. His hand shook a little as he turned the page, then stopped at a line shorter than anyone expected. Full custody granted. No fireworks, just the tick of the wall clock, the faint flicker of a neon light, and a breath let out after months of holding it in. Daniel folded the paper like it was a small flag and slid it into his jacket, close to his heart. That night, the small apartment they'd been renting filled with the smell of chicken soup and toasted bread. Emma set the table. The way she adjusted a spoon just slightly and then straightened it made Daniel smile. They ate slow, didn't talk much. Afterward, he jotted down a schedule on a scrap of paper for the fridge. School drop-off, afternoons at the shop, homework in the evenings. A new routine, simple as pencil lines on paper, steady as any good habit. The next morning, they started on Whisper Timber Yard. The old gate got oiled, losing that wince-inducing metal-on-metal squeal. Daniel climbed up on the roof, replacing rusted panels, tar sticking black and sticky to his gloves, the sharp smell soaking into his clothes. Elliot handled the utilities, the safety checks, stood in the doorway with coffee in hand, going down a checklist in that no-nonsense tone of his. The kind of voice that makes a place feel under control again. Inside, the machines were waking up. Daniel swapped out a dull saw blade, ran it against a pitted grindstone, tiny sparks flaring like fireflies. Cracked belts got replaced, oil reservoirs topped off. Every move had its rhythm. Twist, wipe, fit, test, listen, adjust. He took his time, like rereading an old book line by line. Sometimes he'd stop and rest his hand on Samuel's workbench, feeling the grooves and dents before getting back to it. Emma had a broom and a metal bin. She swept the sawdust into piles, shoveled it up, and poured it into the bin, to sound like rain on a tin roof. When she was tired, she sat on the doorway step, legs swinging, back against the warm wood frame. Sunlight slipped through, dusting her cheek with gold specks. She traced shapes in the thin coat of dust on the bench. A maple leaf, a little house, the letter E, smudged and crooked. The old crew started drifting back without being asked. One stood in the doorway, shy, and called out, "Need an extra hand?" Daniel nodded, tossed some gloves, pointed to the job. No speeches. Someone sanded window frames till they showed clean grain again. Another rewired the overhead lights. Another knelt to fill winter-whitened floor gaps with glue and sawdust. The first day, the saws ran again. Daniel pushed the first plank through. The blade's hum was smooth, steady, like thread feeding through a needle. The cut was clean, the grain clear as running water. He lifted it to his cheek, breathed in a fresh scent. Out on the wire, sparrows startled and flew up, then settled again, heads cocked as if listening to a sound the town used to wake to. Emma clapped once. Soft, like a smile you keep to yourself. Orders trickled in like early signs of spring. A bench for the school library, shelf for the bookstore, a few board for the neighbor's porch repair. Daniel wrote them down in his neat, blocky script, adding little pencil notes. Emma paints, ask Elliot about M8 bolts, borrow nail gun. At night, he chalked lines across the workbench, connecting points like familiar stars. Frank was mostly a ghost now. Once, Daniel saw a black car parked way down the road, engine idling, lights off. A figure sat still behind the wheel, then rolled away without a sound. Daniel didn't follow. He didn't have the space in his mind for chasing anymore. What mattered was here, a saw that needed tuning, a roof that needed sealing, Emma's school schedule, and a kitchen with soup ready when the wind turned cold. Elliot came by now and then, early morning or late afternoon. He'd set down a hot coffee, a couple of envelopes with copies of federal paperwork, then scan the room for what needed doing. On his way out, he might pull the gate latch snug or lift one end of the heavy plank, so Daniel didn't have to. Their friendship had shifted since the war. Fewer words, more work, as solid as a well-set bolt. One evening, Daniel showed Emma the court papers. They sat on the back step of the shop, late sunlight laying long rectangles across the grass. Emma read slowly, lips moving without sound, then folded it and handed it back. No jumping, no shouting, just resting her head on his shoulder. Light as a leaf hitting water, but it sent a deep warmth through him. He didn't say, I promise, or it's all over now. He knew it wasn't, but the bridge between them had been rebuilt, solid wood sunk deep into the ground. Later that night, with Emma asleep, Daniel sat at the workbench and opened a cloth-bound notebook. He sketched a new sign, trying out letters, slim, plain, bold, writing and erasing, circling one, then starting again. Whisper timber. He paused, remembering the words carved into that scrap of pine. Not what you want, but what you must keep. Keeping wasn't just holding on, it was keeping alive, letting it grow, making it a place people could count on. He inked the last word, revival. When the ink dried, it felt like something small but alive had just broken through the soil. Next day, they went for supplies. Paint, screws, wiring, even a new broom for Emma. They went early, when the hardware store was still quiet. Emma pushed the cart, twirling colorful spools of wire with her fingers, laughing under her breath. Daniel held up paint cans to the harsh overhead lights, making sure the color would feel warm in the shop. At the register, he pulled out an old card, took the long receipt, and folded it into his shirt pocket. That slip of paper felt like the heartbeat of something new. Back at the yard, they taped off the wall by the front gate. Emma laid down neat lines of masking tape. Daniel rolled on the first coat. The smell of fresh paint was sharp, but full of promise. The breeze carried it out to the street, mixing with the scent of newly cut wood and damp sawdust. A passerby stopped, breathed deep, and gave a small nod. By late afternoon, Daniel threw open the big doors, letting the shop breathe. The planer hummed in the background. Someone laughed. The radio in the corner played an old tune with easy, plain-spoken lyrics. He shut off the saw, leaned his forehead on his arm for a second, sweat and sawdust on his skin, then straightened, wiping his face on a rag worn thin at the edges. Right then, he knew, this happiness wasn't fragile anymore. It had a shell, a frame. The smell of fresh boards, the steady sound of tuned machines, chalk lines on a bench, the school schedule on the fridge, a clean breakfast bowl drying on the rack, the folded court papers in a drawer. When the shop went dim, only one yellow bulb stayed on, casting a round pool of light like a campfire. Daniel locked the door, the latch clicking home with a sound that was both final and reassuring. He and Emma walked home along their usual route, dry leaves crunching underfoot, their breath hanging in the cool night air. Overhead, the stars were cold, but they were enough to guide you. Tomorrow, the new sign would go up. From then on, the shop story would move at a different rhythm. The rhythm of a place that shelters, of hands that know their craft, of things worth keeping, kept with wood, sweat, and a quiet kind of unity that doesn't need an oath. Ahead, Daniel could feel the night thinning, morning coming right on schedule, like the saw starting up again, like the smell of fresh lumber finding its way into the everyday air of Brookfield, standing as a steady answer to every threat that had passed. That morning, the sun slid slow and low over the squat rooftops of Brookfield, spreading a soft amber stripe across the thin mist that still clung to the shopfront glass. Main Street felt emptier than usual. No rush of footsteps, No chatter spilling from doorways. Just the muted ding from the bakery's old bell across the road and the faint, far-off groan of an early bus winding its way toward the highway. Right there in front of the lumber shop, Daniel stood tall and square-shouldered, holding the new sign like a man might carry something he's earned the right to hold. Whisper Timber Revival. The letters were carved deep, sharp-edged, the kind of cut you don't get from a factory router. You could see where the grain caught the light, and smell the pine oil still seeping from it. Daniel drew in a long, deliberate breath, letting that scent settle into him. His fingertips traced over the smooth grain, the warmth of the wood soaking into his skin. This wasn't like the cold, corporate plaques he'd seen bolted to metal gates in industrial yards. This was handwork, patient work, the sort of thing you only make when you believe in it, even if you never say so out loud. Emma stood beside him, broom in hand, sweeping away the last curls of sawdust from yesterday's work. Her hair was pulled back high, though a few strands had escaped, catching the sunlight and swaying with every sweep. Now, and then she looked up at the sign and smiled. Not the broad, teeth-showing kind, but a small lift at the corners of her mouth. Just enough to tighten something in Daniel's chest, the way a simple, right thing will do when it comes at the end of a long road. He lifted the sign into place, setting it on the wooden frame over the doorway. The hammer rang out steady, thunk, 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 across the quiet street, mixing with the chitter of sparrows somewhere on the tin roof. When the last nail bit home, Daniel stepped back. The morning sun caught the face of the sign at just the right angle, and for a moment, the letters lit up like someone had woken them from a long, hard sleep. The shop door was propped open, letting the sound of a hand plane working a board drift out, steady, even unhurried. The sharp, sweet smell of new-cut pine mixed with the dark warmth of coffee brewing in the back. Inside, Joe Harper, an old buddy from the service, was bent over a bench, showing a skinny teenager how to push the plane without tilting the blade. Over in the far corner, two middle-aged men, both vets too, were marking and cutting boards for a chair frame. The low rumble of their voices wove in and out between the buzz of a saw. It all moved to a slow, sure beat, the kind you recognize the way you recognize an old song you haven't heard in years. Emma put her broom aside and headed to her little work table near the door, piled with scraps of pine and cedar. She picked one up, still smelling of sap, and began painting on it, wildflowers, sparrows, autumn leaves. Daniel had asked her once why she bothered with it. She just shrugged, so it feels warm when people come in. Today, she picked out a round slice of wood, painted an oak tree on it, the shop's symbol, and took it outside to hang right under the new sign. By midday, everyone was gathered around the long work table in the center of the shop. Lunch was plain: ham sandwiches, hot soup, coffee strong enough to cut with a knife. Nobody talked much about the past anymore. Instead, the air was filled with the kind of talk that looks forward, jobs to finish, ideas for the week ahead, and the occasional burst of laughter from the younger crew down at one end. Daniel didn't join in so much as he listened, letting the sound of their voices settle into him. He took in each face, each gesture, the scrape of a chair leg on the old floorboards, the tap of a spoon against a mug. This was the thing he meant to guard, not for himself alone, but for anyone who walked in here looking for a place to start again. Later, as the day leaned toward evening, the light slid through the high windows in narrow beams, turning the floating dust into gold. Daniel stepped outside again, planting himself next to the sign. A moment later, Emma trotted out, still holding a rag. They stood there together, side by side, looking down the narrow street. The breeze carried the smell of fresh lumber into town, weaving it into the scent of coffee, brick, and autumn leaves. Daniel rested his hand on her shoulder, feeling her warmth through the thin fabric. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Both of them knew exactly what it had taken to get here. The losses, the threats, the long nights lying awake, and how every bit of it had led to this patch of quiet ground they now stood on. Inside, the rasp of the plane picked up again, followed by a sudden burst of laughter. It carried like a promise, clear as anything. The shop would live, and it would keep the things worth keeping. Somewhere in the boards and the golden dust, the breath of the men who built this place still lingered. Men like Samuel, steady, stubborn, passing down not just timber, but a legacy made of honor, family, and the stubborn knowledge of what's worth holding on to. Daniel figured that was enough. Enough to get up for in the morning. Enough to work for until his hands wouldn't let him anymore. And standing there with the sunlight catching the new sign, he thought maybe, just maybe, that was what a second chance really looked like. Late afternoon light slanted through the shop's doorway, catching the floating specks of sawdust and turning them into tiny flecks of gold. Daniel sat on the step, his work shirt dusted with shavings, one calloused hand resting on a cup of coffee gone cold. Emma sat a few feet away, her shoes caked with dirt from running in and out all day, cradling the stray cat that had wandered in that morning. No one spoke. There was only the soft rattle of the wind nudging the wooden sign, the steady hum of a saw inside, and the breathing of two people who'd found a small corner of peace in the middle of everything. Daniel looked at his daughter, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was standing against the whole world. He just felt enough. Some things we hold on to, not because they're perfect, but because they once held us up when we were unsteady, like an old house, a worn wooden sign, or a quiet hug on a cold afternoon. The story of Whisper Timber Revival will never really end, because everyone who walks through that door brings their own story and leaves a piece of it behind. If you've ever had a place, a person, or even some worn-down keepsake you've kept, not for its perfection, but for what it meant to you, I'd like to hear about it. Maybe somewhere in what we share, someone out there will find their own reason to keep what's worth keeping.